Hello and welcome back to instalment number 2 of the Anna and Eric Book Club.
Yay!
Yay indeed, yay indeed. Thank you so much for all the responses to the last video. We loved hearing what you thought about the books and the questions, and please do get as involved with these ones. So, our next 2 picks, An Unrestored Woman and The Arab of the Future. We're going to do a little brief summary of each book, so if you haven't read them yet you can kind of get a feel of what we're talking about. And then we're going to have a chat, and hopefully some questions will come out of that, and then we would love you to tell us what you think, basically.
Yeah, and keep the discussion going, and comment below.
Okay, so without further ado,
yes,
we're going to start with An Unrestored Woman by Shobha Rao. So this is a collection of short stories. So the theme of the book, though, is the partition between India and Pakistan, which is quite timely, as it was 70 years ago.
Yeah, so there's been lots of articles in like the newspaper of writers responding and talking about this like huge event, which was massively traumatic for like the countries and the people living there. Yeah.
So this book was one I read when it first came out ages ago, and sort of pushed it into Eric's hands. So I must admit, like my initial thing is I just really keen to just like hear how you felt about it.
I really responded to it, and like particularly because it felt sort of like timely, because just recently I had read The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, Arundhati Roy's huge new novel, which is on the Booker long list this year, and which is very like ambitious and complex and strange, and has a huge amount of like politics in it. So like in a way it was something of a relief like really reading this, because it's much more just about the individual lives of a disparate group of like people and how they loosely interconnect, and but how these larger political events are really affecting them. I read it from start to finish. Like I don't know if you did the same thing of so I think you can see like a definite arc over the course of like the short stories, and you definitely can just like pick out a short story and read it on its own, and it'll like exist on its own. But yeah, I really liked how she set the like flow of the stories. So like in the first story, sorry, there's going to be spoilers because you know, as we said before, this is a book club, so we're going to talk about specific things. But at the end of the first story, which is the title story, An Unrestored Woman, it was so devastating, and I have that thing that you had last time of just like no, I wanted a happy ending, but it was so devastatingly sad, and I just felt like, oh my god, is every story gonna be like this? I don't know if I can take that. But then in the next story, which is called The Merchant's Mistress, it shows the other side of these 2 women who are sort of stuck in this camp together. And in the first story, the female character, something really tragic happens to her, and then in this story, she sort of triumphs over, and she becomes her own woman. And I like how she sort of sent that tension, because you never knew where these stories were going to go. So I found them really gripping in that way, and I found that really effective in showing overall of how, like, you know, these larger political events that happen that affects a lot of the lives of individual people, how that forces people to change and grow and like change the course of their life in a really drastic way. And some people will thrive and survive and like change themselves and change their identities and fit into that new culture, and like some people won't and are going to sort of fall by the wayside. And so yeah, I thought she really captured that tragedy really well.
That's so eloquent. I'm just like, just keep talking. Do you read short stories a lot? And what's your kind of relationship with short story collections?
Like generally I'm like big fan of short stories.
And I think those 2 were 2 of my favourite stories as well. And then I also thought Blindfold was pretty, I mean, it's pretty harrowing, but it's pretty... It also, I think she's really good at introducing moments, like, they're not even like slivers of hope into very harrowing stories.
Yeah.
Which, even though it's quite a, at times like overwhelming read, there's very few stories that don't have that kind of sliver of hope or beauty. Even in that first story, even though the ending is so sad, they have that, you know, there's that moment in the camp. Because in Blindfold, again, spoilers, but the girl gets sold to brothel, and
at a very young age.
It's really, it's difficult to read, isn't it? And but you find out that she's like scratched her way through the wall of the kind of hut that she is kept in, and has like this, like a window, and it doesn't make it okay, but it just is, it's interesting to think about the way that people cope and deal with incredibly harrowing experiences as a way of like, how do you hold on to your humanity, I guess, when you're in like a situation which is just doing everything to wear that away. Like, I would really recommend reading it reading it as a novel essentially, and reading it from start to finish, and not just sort of skipping around. I think that there's obviously been a lot of thought put into the order that the stories are in, and the way that the characters, the way you're introduced to them, and the order that you're introduced to them. So speaking of it being quite a harrowing read, Matthew Sharapa, I hope I'm getting your surname right, made a great YouTube video. Thank you, Matthew.
His YouTube channel is fabulous. He's just like, he has such great fun opinions on like books, and and really interesting, intelligent things to say. So I love watching his channel. Like, hopefully, put a link down to that video below, and we can go watch it.
So his whole video is great, but one of the things that really kind of I was really interested in, I'm going to read this out together, right, because I really like the way that he said it. So he was saying, he was talking about how it's quite a harrowing read, and saying that there can be a disconnect people feel with history, because what is history can sometimes feel like legend. And I think that's a really interesting point. He was talking about the idea of being desensitized to reading about things like this, partly because of the style, if they're told in kind of like a fairy tale sort of style, but also comparing it to things like the Underground Railroad and Human Acts, and books which, you know, are covering really, really harrowing points of history. And you can't become desensitized to reading about them.
And particularly the way he was talking about it, of sort of the slightly dodgy territory where you're getting on, where you make it slightly mythic, and then it feels like that's sort of slightly drawing out of the actual reality of like what happened to these people, and making it more this
but I think that, because I think that she's done that very consciously to stop it being an overwhelmingly difficult, because I did find that I thought she paced it so well. Every time I was getting to the point where I was just like, I'm not sure I can read another story because it's too upsetting, she put one in that was a bit more of a kind of, had that kind of fable feel, and even though the events are rarely sort of pleasant, it was a sort of respite. And I know it's funny with fiction, isn't it? Because there's the element of, but should I still feel upset by these horrible things? But I also feel like you have to kind of lean into what the author is doing, and if the author is choosing to tell this story in this kind of fable way to give you this different perspective, then I'm kind of happy to be led by what the author is sort of trying to do.
But yeah, and I think that's why, you know, we really love reading fiction rather than like the news a lot of the time, because it really draws us into the lives of the people that are involved in these events in a way, you know, which we wouldn't just reading like a headline or like statistics about a particular event. That I think An Unrestored Woman does that so well.
Cool. Okay, so in summary, I think the things I would really like to hear, like what you thought, is, I guess, like short stories generally. Like, I'd be really interested to hear like what is your relationship with short stories. Do you tend, like, how do you read them?
Yeah, do you pick and choose, or do you like try to very studiously like start at the beginning?
Right. And if I'd love to read more collections of short stories like this that are much more like, not just they're all on the same theme, but they're very much like linked to the collection. So if you have any recommendations for books of short stories that are like this, I'd love to sort of find some more of those. Yeah,
or novels, that, because I think a lot of novels like sort of pass themselves off as novels when really they're books of short stories. Just from marketing points, they know novels will sell better. But like I thought, like Sarah Taylor's novel The Shore, which was long-listed for the Bailey's Prize a couple of years ago, was really a book of short stories.
That's actually quite similar to this, isn't it? That's
actually
really good. Like, if you enjoyed The Shore, then I think that you would get a lot out of An Unrestored Woman.
Definitely, yeah.
And then I guess the other thing is like that issue of like reading about like really harrowing things in fiction, and do you tend to be put off by that? Do you kind of use fiction as a way to kind of explore your feelings about that? Do you think that we can get desensitized to talking about kind of really harrowing subjects and moments of history just because their sort of mind so much for fiction.
So the next book that we're going to talk about is this graphic memoir, The Arab of the Future by Riyad Sattouf. This is actually a trilogy, or planned trilogy, because this first volume has been published and the second volume has been published, but not the third one yet. And it's this really unique look at the life of this child, Riyad Sattouf, writing about his early adulthood, because he had quite a complex upbringing where his mother was French and his father was Syrian, and he spent time growing up in those various nations. So he goes from his early childhood, like right after he was born, of living in France, and then they moved to Libya, and then they moved back to France for a while, and then they went to Syria. And because it's a graphic novel and it's presented in this really colorful way, I thought he did this interesting thing where he shows the distinct nations by the particular color that was used. So when it's blue, you know you're in France. When it's pink, you know you're in Syria. And when it's yellow, you're in Libya. And he shows just the experiences, I mean, from the perspective of a child looking at these nations that, like, again, are having like big social upheaval, and the way that the sort of ideologies of those different separate countries were like filtered down into the perspectives of the children, who are just sort of, you know, absorbing it as a sponge in a way, and which, you know, made it really like tragic and harrowing in a different way to read about, because you saw these children really absorbing these ideas, which are very dangerous and very divisive.
Yeah, because in some ways I actually found this one as difficult to read, even though in many ways it's, you know, it's funny, although it's a very sort of dark sense of humour. Yeah,
but there are lots of funny humorous bits.
But I found it really like overwhelming to read because of how children can be so easily influenced, and also just the kind of powerlessness that his mother and he have in this situation. And like his mother like is almost like a kind of, she's always there, but she's almost like a secondary character, because it's seen through his eyes as a child. You know, when you're a child, you're not really thinking how do my parents feel about anything that's happening, but she's always there, and it made me feel.
And he draws her in the background with this sort of slightly like unsure expression on her face, where you can almost see the tension in her, feeling like oh, am I gonna still like go along with this, or am I gonna break away? And yeah, I got really uncomfortable reading about her character and the situation she's in. And it's also interesting how, because he does insert these like larger political things that are happening in the background, where he'll show a bit of television where one of the leaders, like Gaddafi, is like giving some speech or something, or when they actually go to Libya, his father says like, oh yeah, that's Saddam Hussein, he's doing some good things, and you know, in us reading this now with this perspective of history, we're like have, you know, very different opinions about these like political leaders, and so have this whole different perspective on it. But yeah, he shows the child as just sort of like taking this in, and that's just normal, because he doesn't, that's all he knows. I think he really shows in the book how, like, you know, the majority of people in the nation, they want to believe in their leader, and they want to believe that their leader's doing good things for them, and so we'll sort of go along with it to like almost like the absolute breaking point, where it's almost like you can't deny that things are like really bad and this isn't working and we need a different system. So yeah, you see a lot of adults in this book who are like living under this delusion that like, oh yeah, everything's fine, even though we're living in these structures that are crumbling around. But at the same time, like, I think he brings in like the humanity of the characters into it a lot, especially showing different members of his family, which made it like really relatable for me. Like there's one point where he like goes to see his grandmother, and it's quite like a cringeworthy scene, because he has like some dirt in his eye, and so his grandmother comes over and licks his eye, and it's so cringeworthy, but it like really took me back to like when I was a boy and I had dirt on my face. My grandmother would always come over spit on a tissue
yeah.
and then rub my face, which is like so like horribly intimate, but you know, you're just like, you have to take it as a child, and
it's funny that because I have like really visceral memories of my dad getting his handkerchief out and like licking it, and like it just
and you're like oh and thinking back on that, it's just like, oh, it's so cringe. But you know, this like odd intimacy of like of families, of things that like happen.
Something I found really interesting was the way that being a boy, he does not have to engage with some of the things that he is sort of vaguely uncomfortable about. And it made me really think about the way that, not just with gender, but anything where you're the minority, or you're in the group that has the least power, you are forced to like deal with stuff because you can't not. I was really struck by, you know, like he goes and he's like, oh, isn't that funny, like all the women in the family have to eat, like basically eat leftovers and second, and he's just like, yeah. Whereas if he was a girl, he would immediately be like, but what, like, why is that? What does that mean about my life, and like how do I feel about that? Whereas he kind of is just able to, and it's not like a criticism, it's just like, you know, how power structures work, but it just shows how like,
as opposed to the short story collection, which is you really felt like this was from the point of view of a woman who could like see and understand and feel these things,
right.
Whereas this is definitely from the perspective of a man,
right?
Although you know he is like an outsider sort of in these Arab societies he's brought into, because he being from a French mother, he has like this bright blonde hair, and so obviously stands out in Arab culture and gets a lot of flack for that.
Right.
But yeah, absolutely. Like
it's not a criticism, and also he's a child. Like, but I think it just shows that how, because you see it through a child's eyes, it did sort of make me. It just made me think about how early those things are. Like how young you are when you're told what you should be worrying about.
Do you read much graphic?
No, it's not something I'm like into, and I'm not like. I think for a long time I felt like because I didn't read like comics and like series and superheroes, I was like, oh no, it's not for me.
Yeah,
and then increasingly there's so much interesting stuff like this, and actually I think it's been around, and it's just I haven't been aware of it. But I think as well publishers are increasingly sort of publishing really interesting stuff. Like Jonathan Cape has such an amazing graphic novel list. And one of my favourite books that I read last year was 100 Nights of Hero.
Oh, which I just got a copy of that, and I know you thought so highly of it. So
I loved it so much. And I think, so that kind of thing I really love. And again, the year before that, one of my favourite books of the year was, I'm going to get it the wrong way around, Becoming Unbecoming.
Oh yeah,
Luna, and I just I thought that was such an incredible book.
But let us know, because I'd really like some more suggestions for graphic novels or graphic memoirs. If you're a big fan of them and you have some particular favorites, like definitely let us know in the comments below, because I'd really like to know. But also, like generally, like would you be too nervous or afraid to like sort of, or not afraid, but like are you slightly hesitant about like picking up a like graphic novel because you feel like it might be too alienating or something? Let us know your feelings about that.
So that is these two books. I hope you've enjoyed listening. I hope it's made you think. I hope you have some thoughts as well. Please do respond to any or all of what we've been talking about, or just introduce entirely new subjects if we haven't covered what you were interested in.
Or just say hi. Like, it's nice to say hi.
Yeah. Next two books are Under the Ujala Trees by Channa Pranta and Your Heart is the Muscle the Size of a Fist by Sunil Yappa, and we will be reading those through September, and the video will go up at the sort of tail end of September, beginning of October, around then. Yes. I love both these books so much, so I'm really excited to see what you make of them.
It's going to be a great conversation.
It'd be lots to talk about. Okay.
So get in touch with us. But as Anna said, she'll list below all the ways of getting in touch with us. And we'd love to hear more of your comments and thoughts and discussion. And keep reading. And
please subscribe to my channel, and also go and subscribe to Eric's channel to make sure that you don't miss any of the videos, because we're alternating them between our two channels.
Yeah, switching back and forth.
And we will see you at the end of September.
Happy reading, everyone.